Total silence. Most people think silence is a void. They think it's just the absence of noise. But in the theater of human behavioral mechanics, absolute silence is a weapon. It is a high-voltage behavioral pattern interruption. And when a highly calibrated empath finally turns the dial to absolute zero and enters a state of total, unyielding silence, a countdown begins. Right now, somewhere in the world, an avoidant individual is running a familiar script. They pushed, they distanced, they cold-shouldered, and they withdrew. They did this because, in their psychological architecture, distance equals safety. They wanted to see if they could control the emotional temperature of the room. They expected the chase. They engineered the pursuit. They needed the empath to beg, to fix, to cry, or to scream, because that reaction proves to the avoidant that they are still the anchor of the relationship. It gives them a baseline metric of control. But this time, the script just broke. The empath didn't chase. The empath went silent. In the next few minutes, we are going to dissect the hidden, unspoken, and terrifying psychological machinery that is triggered when an avoidant pushes an empath into true silence. We aren't looking at this from a surface level of hurt feelings or relationship advice. We are going underneath the skin. We are looking at the exact structural collapse of the avoidant's ego defense mechanisms. If you have ever wondered why someone who seems so cold, so detached, and so untouchable suddenly panics, obsessively stalks your social media, or completely falls apart weeks after they were the ones who walked away, you are about to get the exact blueprint. By the end of this breakdown, you will understand the precise phase shift that happens inside the avoidant brain when their safety mechanism becomes their worst nightmare. More importantly, you will discover the dangerous mistake most empaths make right at the edge of this collapse that resets the toxic loop all over again, and exactly how to spot the psychological tells that mean the avoidance mask is permanently cracking. If you miss even one of these stages, you will misread the behavior entirely, and you'll fall right back into the trap they inadvertently set for you. Pay close attention to the behavioral metrics we are about to lay out. The shift is invisible until it is catastrophic. Look at the person who constantly pulls away. To the untrained eye, they look powerful. They look like they hold all the cards. They walk away from arguments. They leave messages on read. And they treat human connection like a game of chicken, where the first person to show emotion loses. But if you analyze the psychological architecture of the avoidant, you realize something very different. Their strength is an optical illusion. It is a house of cards built on a single, fragile assumption. That assumption is that the empath will always be standing at the gate, waiting to let them back in. The avoidant relies on your pursuit to stabilize their nervous system. But what happens when the gate vanishes? What happens when the person who cared the most simply stops broadcasting an emotional signal? Today, we are stripping away the facade. We are looking at the exact behavioral anatomy of a collapse. Because when an avoidant pushes an empath so far that the empath's internal system clicks into absolute silence, the avoidant doesn't just get lonely. They structurally collapse. To understand why this happens, we have to look at the behavioral loop. Avoidants don't run from connection because they hate it. They run because proximity triggers panic. So they push you away to lower their anxiety. But here is the catch. They still need to know you are there. Your texts, your tears, your desperate attempts to clarify things, that is the data they use to measure their own safety. It tells them, I am safe, I am in control, and I can return whenever I want. When the empath goes silent, the data stream cuts to black. There is no feedback loop. For a behavioral profiler, a lack of data is a nightmare. For an avoidant, it is psychological vertigo. The silence strips away their control and hands it completely back to the empath, without the empath lifting a single finger. Initially, the avoidant will feel a sense of relief. They'll think, finally, the pressure is off. This is phase one. But as the days turn into weeks, the silence begins to compound. The avoidance mind operates on a delay. When the relief fades, the vacuum begins to pull. Without the empath's emotional noise to focus on, the avoidant is forced to look at the one thing they have spent their entire lives running from: themselves. The silence acts as a giant mirror. They start asking, "Why aren't they fighting for me? Did they find someone else? Was I that easy to erase?" The ego, starved of the validation of your pursuit, begins to cannibalize itself. This is where the collapse shifts from a quiet worry into an operational crisis. The avoidance brain enters a state of hypervigilance. They will begin what we call passive proximity seeking. They will check your social media profiles, look for changes in your behavior, or ask mutual friends about you, all while trying to maintain a facade of absolute indifference. But underneath the mask, the baseline is shattered. They are realizing that your silence isn't a game of silent treatment. It isn't a manipulative tactic to get them back. True empathic silence is an energetic eviction notice. It is the moment the empath realizes that the cost of admission to their life is simply too high for the avoidant to pay. When an avoidant realizes that the silence is real, their suppression mechanism fails. All the grief, all the attachment needs, and all the suppressed emotion they buried during the relationship comes rushing to the surface all at once. It is a dam breaking. They are hit with the full weight of the loss, but without the emotional coping skills to process it. This is the moment they look text messages over from months ago, obsess over micro details, and experience profound regret. The very distance they fought so hard to establish becomes a prison of their own making. The collapse of an avoidant after an empath goes silent is a masterclass in human behavioral mechanics. It proves that you cannot weaponize distance against someone who knows their own value without eventually isolating yourself. If you are an empath who has finally reached that point of total silence, understand this: your stillness is not passive. It is the most profound boundary you can ever establish. You have stopped participating in a script that was designed to keep you small. When you refuse to dance, the music stops. And when the music stops for an avoidant, they are finally forced to sit in the quiet reality of what they threw away. Keep your baseline steady, hold your ground, and let the silence do the work. The illusion of the upper hand is the foundational operational error of the avoidance strategy. To properly decode this behavior, we have to look past the surface-level presentation of coldness, indifference, or emotional detachment, and look directly at the underlying mechanics of control. When an avoidant creates distance, whether that is through monosyllabic text replies, abrupt physical withdrawal, or the sudden implementation of an emotional stone wall, it appears to the outside world, and deeply to the empath, like an act of absolute power. The avoidant behaves as though they possess an infinite surplus of independence, moving through the relationship with the posture of someone who can take it or leave it. This posture is highly effective. It is designed to trigger an immediate panic response in the target. In the initial phases of this dynamic, it works perfectly. The avoidant steps back, and the empath, driven by a high baseline need for connection and harmony, steps forward to fill the void. This sequence establishes a specific behavioral loop where the avoidant is the anchor and the empath is the satellite orbiting their emotional state. What the avoidant does not realize, because their defense mechanisms are entirely unconscious, is that this feeling of having the upper hand is completely synthetic. It is not derived from true self-sufficiency or emotional maturity. It is entirely dependent on the empath's frantic reaction. The avoidant's entire sense of safety and dominance during their withdrawal phase is fueled by the data the empath sends back. Every frantic phone call, every long paragraphs explaining feelings, and every tearful plea for clarity is a metric that the avoidant uses to calibrate their own ego. Those reactions tell the avoidant's nervous system, "I am still the prize, I am still in control, and I can dictate the terms of this engagement whenever I choose to return. The upper hand only exists if there is a hand to hold on the other side of the rope. It is a psychological game of tug-of-war, where the avoidant feels strong precisely because they can feel the immense tension of the empath pulling with everything they have. The absolute catastrophic failure of this strategy occurs when the empath undergoes a sudden behavioral phase shift and drops the rope entirely. When the empath stops pulling, stops fixing, and enters a state of unyielding absolute silence, the illusion of the upper hand vanishes instantly. There is no transition period. It is an immediate drop to zero baseline. Without the empath's pursuing energy, the avoidant is left holding a slack rope, pulling against nothing but empty air. The silence of the empath completely rewrites the power dynamic because it deprives the avoidant of the very reactions they were using to validate their distance. They expected a chase, they engineered a pursuit, and instead, they hit a blank brick wall of non-engagement. This high-voltage pattern interruption shatters the avoidant's illusion of control. They suddenly find themselves in a psychological vacuum where they can no longer measure their importance or their safety by how hard the empath is fighting for them. The very distance they created to feel powerful and safe now turns into a terrifying expanse of isolation, revealing that their apparent strength was never real. It was merely a parasite feeding on the empath's emotional exhaustion. The behavioral calibration shift occurs at the exact microsecond the empath transitions from the role of the pursuer to that of an absolute ghost. In any ongoing interpersonal system, individuals establish what behavioral profilers call a baseline, a predictable pattern of reactions, emotional responses, and communication frequencies that both parties use to navigate the relationship. For a long time, the avoidance internal software has been calibrated to a very specific empathic baseline. This baseline dictated that whenever the avoidant withdrew, the empath would inevitably overcompensate by radiating higher levels of emotional warmth, pursuing communication, and attempting to fix the perceived fracture. The avoidant relies heavily on this predictable baseline. It acts as their emotional radar system, telling them exactly where they stand without them having to risk vulnerability. However, when the empath reaches their absolute threshold of emotional exhaustion, a profound and structural recalibration takes place within their psychological architecture. They stop reacting. They don't throw a tantrum. They don't issue ultimatums, and they don't deliver a dramatic final speech. Instead, they quietly flip a switch from active engagement to a total cessation of emotional transmission. This sudden shift is a massive, high-intensity pattern interruption that completely blindsides the avoidant's internal radar. The avoidant expects the usual script to play out, but when they look into the psychological space where the empath's anxious pursuit used to be, they find an absolute, echoing void. This lack of behavioral data completely disrupts the avoidant's internal safety metrics. Human beings are fundamentally wired to detect changes in their environment, and in the context of behavioral profiling, a sudden, unexplained drop in a baseline behavior is the most alarming signal an individual can receive. The avoidance brain suddenly realizes that the rules of the game have changed without their consent. They are no longer the ones dictating the distance. The empath has hijacked the controls and established an impenetrable boundary of non-engagement. This shift strips away the avoidance ability to predict the empath's next move, throwing them into a state of acute cognitive dissonance. They begin to obsessively analyze the silence, trying to decode a message that isn't there. Because the empath is no longer broadcasting any emotional signals, the avoidant can no longer calibrate their own ego or validate their need for independence based on the empath's suffering. The silence acts as a complete blackout of interpersonal feedback. This behavioral calibration shift effectively reverses the psychological roles within the dynamic. The empath, by choosing absolute silence, steps entirely out of the toxic loop and into a position of detached observation, while the avoidant, stripped of their predictable baseline and starved of the data they require to maintain their facade of indifference, begins to drift aimlessly in an unfamiliar space of profound uncertainty and mounting internal panic. The mechanics of the void refer to the profound psychological vacuum that forms the moment an empath completely halts the transmission of emotional data. To understand this vacuum, one must realize that an avoidant individual does not operate in a vacuum of their own making. Their entire internal defense structure requires an external foil. They use the empath's high-volume emotional output, their worries, their constant checking in, their visible investments, as a psychological buffer. This buffer allows the avoidant to keep their own deeper, repressed emotional conflicts at bay. As long as the empath is crying out, fighting for connection, or actively agonizing over the distance, the avoidant can focus entirely on managing the external pressure. They can look at the empath and label them as too needy or irrational, which effectively shifts the blame and keeps the avoidant's focus projected outward. But when the empath goes completely silent, that external screen is violently ripped away. The void that replaces it is not just empty space, it is a pressurized psychological chamber. Without the empath's emotional noise to react to, the avoidant's internal radar begins to experience severe signal deprivation. In behavioral psychology, when an organism is accustomed to a specific high-intensity feedback loop, and that loop is abruptly cut to absolute zero, the brain enters a state of hypervigilance. The silence acts as a giant, pristine mirror held up to the avoidant's psyche. There are no more distractions, no more texts to ignore, and no more emotional demands to complain about. The avoidant is suddenly trapped in a room with nothing but their own unhealed attachment trauma and buried inadequacies. The very silence they force the empath into now begins to echo back their deepest fear: ultimate abandonment and unworthiness. They are forced to confront the haunting questions they spent a lifetime running from. They start wondering if they are fundamentally unlovable, if they have finally crossed a line from which there is no return, and if the empath has realized that life is significantly more peaceful without them. The ego, which was previously inflated by the illusion of independence, suddenly finds itself starved of the validation it didn't even realize it was consuming. This vacuum begins to actively cannibalize the avoidance defense mechanisms. The silence becomes so loud, and the lack of behavioral data becomes so disorienting, that the avoidance mind begins to invent scenarios to fill the gap. They replay old conversations, dissect past interactions, and look for hidden meanings in the empath's final movements. The void completely destabilizes their internal equilibrium because it deprives them of the one thing their strategy required to succeed: a constant, predictable baseline of empathic misery that they could use to measure their own false sense of security. The collapse protocol marks the systematic deconstruction of the avoidant's entire ego defense architecture. This is the precise phase where the avoidant realizes that the empath's silence is not a temporary tactical retreat, a manipulative game of the silent treatment, or a plea for attention. It is a permanent, structural recalibration of boundaries. Up until this specific juncture, the avoidant's internal operating system has been running on the assumption that they could initiate a system restore whenever they chose, simply by throwing the empath an emotional bone or a breadcrumb of communication. When the reality sets in that the empath has genuinely closed the ledger and checked out of the dynamic, the avoidant's primary coping mechanism, which is hyperindependence, completely short-circuits. In behavioral profiling, we observe that a defense mechanism only functions effectively when it successfully protects the individual from anxiety. The moment that defense mechanism actually increases anxiety, it triggers an internal operational crisis. The avoidance brain suddenly shifts from a state of self-satisfied detachment into a state of acute threat assessment. They realize that their strategy of pushing away has worked too well. They have successfully engineered their own exile. This realization triggers a cascade of psychological failures inside their cognitive architecture. The ego defenses that previously felt like an impenetrable fortress now begin to feel like a prison cell of isolation. The avoidant starts to experience a profound sense of powerlessness, which is the exact emotion their avoidance was originally designed to prevent. As the collapse protocol accelerates, the avoidance baseline behavior becomes highly erratic. They experience an intense breakdown of cognitive consistency. They might find themselves driving past places that remind them of the empath, staring at the phone for hours waiting for a digital footprint that never materializes, or engaging in compulsive behaviors to numb the rising tide of internal panic. The mask of calm indifference completely fractures, revealing a deeply disorganized internal state that is entirely unequipped to handle the weight of real, permanent loss. They can no longer rationalize their behavior by convincing themselves that the empath was the problem, because the empath is no longer doing anything at all. The absolute absence of interaction forces the avoidant to bear the full, crushing weight of their own destructive patterns, driving them into a state of psychological paralysis, where every single one of their historical tools for emotional regulation completely fails to function. The return of a suppressed is the final, catastrophic phase of the breakdown, where the avoidance internal dam completely bursts under the pressure of the empath's unyielding silence. For months, or perhaps even years, the avoidant has relied on a psychological mechanism called emotional suppression to maintain their baseline of detached stability. Whenever feelings of vulnerability, deep connection, or fear of loss arose during the relationship, the avoidant simply pushed those emotions deep into the subconscious cellar of their mind. They were able to keep that cellar door locked precisely because the empath's loud, pursuing energy acted as an external counterweight, holding the door shut from the outside. But when the empath steps away and drops into total, absolute silence, that external counterweight vanishes completely. The vacuum created by the silence pulls the cellar door wide open, and every single emotion the avoidant has spent a lifetime running from comes rushing to the surface all at once. This is an involuntary emotional flood, a profound psychological phenomenon where the brain's ability to repress data fails entirely due to acute isolation stress. The avoidant is suddenly hit with the full, unadulterated weight of the loss, the grief, and the attachment anxiety that they had previously managed to completely ignore. It is a state of severe internal disorganization. The very person who seemed entirely untouchable, cold, and utterly indifferent just weeks prior is suddenly plunged into a state of intense, obsessive fixation. Their cognitive processing is hijacked by the memory of the empath. They begin to experience what behavioral profilers recognize as a hyperfixation loop, where they obsessively replay micro-details of past interactions, read through old text messages from months or years ago, and dissect the final moments of the relationship with surgical precision. They are looking for a crack in the silence, some sign that the empath still cares, or that the bridge hasn't been completely burned down. The avoidance nervous system enters a state of high-intensity panic because they completely lack the internal emotional infrastructure or coping mechanisms required to process this level of raw, unfiltered emotional pain. They have spent their entire lives mastering the art of running away, and now they find themselves trapped in a psychological room with nowhere left to run. This emotional flood completely dismantles their sense of time. Weeks or months may have passed since the initial separation, but to the collapsing avoidant, the pain suddenly feels as raw and immediate as if it happened 5 minutes ago. The profound irony of this final phase is that the distance they fought so bitterly to establish, the cold independence they weaponized against the empath's warmth,